Right. Let's see, we finished up in the spring our study of Christian evidences. And you recall that one of the evidences that we talked about as far as for the existence of God, is the fact that there was the existence of a supernatural book which bears the marks of divinity. And there is. And one of the things that, one of the reasons that we know that the Bible is from God that we talked about under that section of our study was the existence, one of the strongest evidences for that is the existence of predictive prophecy and the amazing accuracy that the Bible displays when God talks about things that are going to happen perhaps years, perhaps centuries, thousands of years in advance. And only an all-knowing Creator could do that. We talked about in our study 2 or 3 years ago about the nature of God and the fact that He is eternal. The Bible says He is from everlasting to everlasting. What that means is it's very hard for us to comprehend. You ever watch one of those movies where people travel back and forth in time? And how frustrating and confusing and that can make you trying to figure that out? Because nobody can travel through time anyway. But the fact of the matter is, God is not a time-bound entity. And so He sees everything in the present. In other words, He told Moses, actually, Christ told Moses from the bush, I am that I am, meaning I'm always in the present. So anything that happened here, He sees it now. Anything in the future, it's all the same to Him. That's very difficult for us as time-bound creatures to understand. But He's always in the present. So there is no past, present, or future with Him. It's all the same. So it's very easy for Him to say, or to tell His prophet who's writing, what's going to happen as far as we're concerned 400, 500, 1,000 years down the road, because it's not 500 or 1,000 years down the road for Him. Okay? And that's very hard to grasp, but that's the nature of God. And so, as I was thinking about all that, as we finished up our study of Christian evidences, I thought about a study we did a few years ago on principles of Old Testament prophecy. And I thought it would be good to revisit that subject. And as I was thinking about it, I thought, we just did that like 2 years ago. I don't need to do that again right now. And then I looked at my list. We did it in 2014. So I'm thinking, I guess I'm getting old because that's 2 years ago. So time flies when you're having fun, as they say. And so I did want to look at that again, but I wanted to do it a little bit differently. I was also thinking at the same time about where to go next in this class, about the world in which we live and the situation our country finds itself in and the chaos that we see all around us and how, that disturbs people. It certainly disturbs rational people, right-thinking people. And, even Christians can get a little concerned and worried about the direction of our nation and what's going on around us. And so I got to thinking about prophecy, and I got to thinking about the situation of our country. There's one book in the Bible that I know of that deals with those issues perhaps as good as any other. And that's the book of Daniel. And the reason I say that is this. The lessons that it teaches about God and who is in control of governments, what goes on in the world, is explicitly laid out in the book of Daniel. But number two, I like what one commentator said about Daniel. Here's what we do with Daniel. Adults don't study chapters 1 through 6 because who studies those? Vacation Bible School kids, right? You study Daniel in the lion's den and Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah in the fiery furnace and all that stuff. You do that in Vacation Bible School. And then nobody wants to study chapter 7 through 12. Why? It's difficult. But here's the thing. When we don't study chapter 7 through 12, we miss some of the most amazing prophetic material that you will ever read in your life. It's unbelievable how detailed the prophecies are in chapters 7 through 12. And no, they're not all easy. And people don't always agree on every detail. Commentators don't. But that's okay. But they need to be studied. Daniel is what I would call, it is the bridge It is the bridge between the Old Testament and the New Testament. Why do I say that? I mean, it was written. It wasn't the last book written. I mean, Nehemiah was doing his work in the middle 400s. Daniel lived in the 500 BC era. But why is it a bridge between the Old and New Testament? Because a lot of its prophecies deal with what? Coming of Christ, but also the intertestament period. How many of us know a lot about, I mean, here's the deal. We closed the Old Testament. The Jews have returned to their homeland. Ezra and Zerubbabel, along with the preaching of Haggai and Zechariah, have caused the people to finally rebuild the temple. Nehemiah comes along and rebuilds what? Walls of the city of Jerusalem. And the Old Testament closes around, 450, 430 something BC. And they're under what regime? What government are they under? Who's in control of that part of the world? Yeah, the Persians, the Medo-Persian Empire. We open up the New Testament and we find the Jews, there's no Medes and Persians. There's not even any Greeks in charge. We've missed a whole empire. And who's in charge? The Romans are in charge. There's a Jewish council called the Sanhedrin. The high priest is a political position, even. There's things like Sadducees and Pharisees and Zealots and Essenes. Where did all these people come from? All of that developed in the 400 years in between for various reasons. So I thought it was about time that we studied the book of Daniel in here. But I want to begin. Here's what we did the last time we talked about principles of Old Testament prophecy. We defined prophecy. We looked at 3 types of supernatural prophecy. We looked at critical elements of predictive prophecy. We then looked at 2 types of predictive prophecy, 2 categories of prophetic language. Then we looked at some things on principles on how to recognize and interpret prophetic language. Then, for the second half of the study, this is what we did. We looked at various case studies. And here's what we looked at 6 years ago. The curse of Jericho, the prophecy of Josiah, prophecies concerning Sennacherib, Cyrus, the overthrow of Babylon, Jehoiachin, Zedekiah, the Jewish nation as a whole, and we looked at a lot of messianic prophecies. That was our case studies after we talked about these various principles. We're not going to do any of that this time. We're going to cover the basic principles again over the next 2 or 3 weeks. And then our case study is going to be 1 book. And that's the book of Daniel. Because I don't know of a book that speaks to us more today than any other. And of course, I could say that about anything when it comes to the Bible. There's been a lot of commentaries written by men in the Brotherhood on the book of Daniel. One that's been popular over the years, pretty well known, is one by McGuigan. And near the end of his book, he makes this statement. The book, as it began, ends with an affirmation that everything is under God's control. He is the sovereign of times and seasons. We've got to get a hold on this and live as though it were a deep conviction with us. So, if you want to know how to deal with the chaos that is around you, because the world is always going to be in chaos, you have to come to a deep conviction of who's in control ultimately. And here's one thing you're going to learn from the book of Daniel. There's not a person in this world that cannot be used by God for His purposes. Do you know that? And did you know He uses both good people and evil people? Now, it has nothing to do with their eternal destiny. If I want to live with God in eternity, I need to cooperate with Him and let Him use me. But He doesn't need my permission to use me. He uses evil people all the time to accomplish His purposes. And they don't cooperate with Him, and they don't love Him, and they don't submit to Him. He'll use them anyway. It just means that their eternal destiny is not going to turn out very well. But as far as this life is concerned, He uses both good and evil people, both good and evil nations, by the way. As Habakkuk learned, you remember what God told Habakkuk? He said, I'm going to tell you something you're not going to believe. Tell me. I'm going to take a nation that's more evil than yours and punish you with them. I'm going to bring the Babylonians. Habakkuk said, how can you do that? Because he's from everlasting to everlasting. He knows what's best for everybody and every nation. Turn over to Acts chapter 17. Then we're going to get into prophecy and prophetic principles. You know, I get sick of religious people talking about with God that there's no boundaries, no borders. Well, just let people in. Well, would you let them in your house? Anybody want to come in your house and live? Would you let them do that? Well, if we're Christian people, we should let them do that in our nation. Just open up the borders and let anybody in, no matter what whether they're good or evil or whether it's legal or not. No borders with God, really? Have you ever read Acts chapter 17, Paul's sermon to the Athenians? Look at verse 26. And He has made from one blood every nation of men to dwell on all the face of the earth. Now, what does this next phrase say? He has determined their pre-appointed times and what? The boundaries of their dwellings. The bounds of their habitations. Who's determined the borders? Who's determined what nations rise and fall? God does. People don't. God determines all of that. Nations come and go because God wills it. I'm not talking about an overruling of people's free moral agency. I'm talking about the fact that God can rule providentially in the lives of men and nations and use them for His purposes, even though they're making their own choices. Because He's from everlasting to everlasting. He's always in the present. So He knows what you're going to do. He knows the way I think. He knows the choices I'm going to make. He doesn't cause them. He doesn't make me to do it, but He knows me. He knows how many hairs are on my head. So do you think He knows what my thoughts are? Do you think He knows what choices I would make in any given situation? But we'll talk about that more when we get to Daniel. Let's talk about prophecy. When we talk about prophecy, when I use the word prophet or prophesy or prophecy, what do we know? What normally comes to mind What do I think of? Yeah, telling the future. Right. Predictive prophecy, what we would call. Because, and frankly, that's what we're used to, and that is a powerful argument for the inspiration of the Bible and the validity and genuineness of the Christian system. And we see it over and over again. And in fact, if I pull out a Hebrew or Greek lexicon or something like that, if I pull out or a dictionary, if I pull out Vines or Mounts or somebody like that, most of the definitions are going to talk about those words being used in a very technical sense. In other words, I'm receiving information supernaturally and things of this nature. However, if you were to do a research on the etymology of the words, Hebrew and Greek words that are used for that, and there is some discussion, maybe some disagreement. I'm not sure they know exactly where the words came from, but it would seem to indicate that in their simplest form, the word prophesy can simply mean to speak forth or to announce. And there's actually more than just predictive prophecy in the Bible. It doesn't necessarily, the context will tell you, but it may not necessarily even have to involve something miraculous. There could be a broader connotation or use of the word in a few instances. And so, this idea of speaking forth or announcing, being a spokesman for somebody, if you will. Let's all turn over to Exodus chapter 7. Let's look at this idea of being a spokesperson or a spokesman. Look at verses 1 and 2 of Exodus 7. So the Lord said to Moses, "See, I have made you as a god to Pharaoh." Was Moses a god? Was he divine? No, in fact, in my Bible, it's added in as there's the word "as" is actually added to the text to let you know that no, he's not really a god. But what's his point? I've made you as God to Pharaoh, and Aaron your brother shall be your what? Prophet. So guess what, Moses? You're going to have a prophet. You're going to have a spokesperson. You shall speak all that I command you. Now if God gives Moses a message, it's going to be supernatural, right? God speaking to anybody, that's supernatural. But what are you going to do? You're going to tell Aaron, right? You shall speak all that I command you, and Aaron your brother shall tell Pharaoh to send the children of Israel out of his land. And we get a little more explanation on that if you go back to chapter 4. Well, why was God going to make Aaron a spokesperson or a prophet for Moses? Why was he going to do that? Yeah, remember Moses' complaint. He complained, he had a lot of complaints, but one of them was about his ability to speak publicly. So let's pick up in about verse 10. Then Moses said to the Lord, "O my Lord, I am not eloquent, neither before nor since you have spoken to your servant, but I am slow of speech and slow of tongue." So the Lord said to him, "Who has made man's mouth? Or who makes the mute, the deaf, the seeing, or the blind? Have not I the Lord? Now therefore go, and I will be with your mouth and teach you what you shall say." But he said, "O my Lord, please send by the hand of whomever else you may send." So the anger of the Lord was kindled against Moses, and he said, "Is not Aaron the Levite your brother? I know that he can speak well. And look, he is also coming out to meet you. When he sees you, he will be glad in his heart. Now you shall speak to him and put the words in his mouth. And I will teach you what you shall do. So he shall be your spokesman to the people. And he himself shall be as a mouth for you, and you shall be to him as God." All right? Moses said, "I can't speak." That's okay. Aaron's a good speaker. I'll tell you what I want you to know, and you tell him what I've told you, and he'll be your prophet. He'll be your spokesperson. Well, and I suppose that God could have, and maybe he did some, tell Aaron something directly, and if he did, that would have been supernatural. But if God is telling Moses something, and then Moses is just going to turn around and tell Aaron, there's nothing supernatural about Moses telling Aaron, and yet the Bible says he's a prophet. So in that sense, I guess what I'm saying in that context, that word is not being used in some supernatural way. It's being used in the sense that he's his spokesman. There's also some interesting use of the word, and I think this could either be supernatural or not. But turn over to 1 Chronicles chapter 25. 1 Chronicles 25. 25. Let's read the first 3 verses. This is kind of an interesting use of the word. Moreover, David and the captains of the army separated for the service some of the sons of Asaph, of Heman and Jeduthun, and of Jeduthun who should prophesy. Notice who should what? Prophesy. What are they going to prophesy with? Harps, stringed instruments, and cymbals. And the number of the skilled men performing their service was of the sons of Asaph, Zachar and Joseph, Nethaniah and Asherelah, and the sons of Asaph were under the direction of Asaph, who prophesied according to the order of the king. Of Jeduthun, the sons of Jeduthun, I'm not going to read all those, now notice, who prophesied with a harp to do what? What was their prophesying involved? What were they doing? They were giving thanks and praising the Lord. Well, that's kind of an interesting use of the term. So he's going to prophesy with a harp. Ultimately, their prophesying was to do what, according to verse 3? Give thanks and to praise the Lord. Was that some supernatural thing? In the case of Asaph, I suppose it could have been. Why? How would I know that? How would I know? Where have I read his name? Well, he's written a bunch of psalms. He wrote several psalms, but he's not the only person mentioned here. A bunch of the guys are mentioned, sons of these people. So I don't know whether that necessarily means that, well, what if they just took a psalm that was already written and just used that to give thanks and praise? Well, that wouldn't be anything super. We do that. I can pick up a psalm book and find a song in here it's an exact duplication of a psalm that Asaph or Moses or David wrote. And I can sing it. There's nothing supernatural about that. I'm just pointing out that the word used there is kind of interesting. He said they're prophesying. And I don't know if that necessarily meant that there was anything miraculous about that or not. But here's the bottom line. When we do think of the word prophecy, we obviously normally think of the supernatural. And we think about predictive prophecy. So let's talk about the supernatural. But here's the other thing. When we think of supernatural prophecy, we normally think of what? What did we just say? Predicting the what? Future. We think of predicting the future. There are 3 types of supernatural prophecy. Predicting the future is the third one. What's the first one? Talking about the what? Go the opposite way. The past. So obviously what's number 2? The present. You can have supernatural prophecy that talks about the past, the present, or the future. You say, well, give me an example. Okay. First of all, go to Deuteronomy 18. Make one point before we hit those 3. And let's go to verse 15. Now Moses wrote what? Well, what other books did he write? He wrote the first 5. And some Psalms as well. Was Moses a prophet? How do I know that? Deuteronomy 18, look at verse 15. The Lord your God will raise up for you a prophet like who? Me, from your midst, from your brethren. Him you shall hear, according to all you desired of the Lord your God in Horeb in the day of the assembly, saying, Let me not hear again the voice of the Lord my God, nor let me see this great fire anymore, lest I die. Now, I know from Acts chapter 3, verse 22, that Moses is talking about who? Christ. Peter says Moses is talking about Christ. That's not really our discussion here today. But the point is, Moses is a prophet. Okay? Given supernatural knowledge and abilities. Well, did Moses, I haven't gotten to it yet, but did Moses do any predictive prophecy? The kind that we normally think about? Did he write any predictive prophecy? Anybody? Yes, good answer, yes. Give me an example. Genesis 3:15. We'll come back to that. But let's think about it. Genesis 1:1 says what? In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. Let me ask you this. How many people were around when that happened? So can we all agree that Moses wasn't alive when that happened? Now here's Moses receiving supernatural knowledge about what kind of events? Past. Moses wasn't there. In fact, they happened several thousand years before Moses was around. At least a few thousand. Right? So, Moses lived around 1500 BC. At the very least, 3,500, 4,000 years. Maybe a little more. Bottom line is, Moses is prophesying. He's receiving supernatural knowledge. Moses wasn't around when anything happened in the garden between Adam and Eve and God. He wasn't around for Cain and Abel. He wasn't around for any of those events. He wasn't around for Noah and the flood. And yet, he wrote about it. So, that's prophecy regarding the past. He catalogs. As his role as a prophet, part of it was past events. What about present? Let's talk about an example of present. Let's turn over to Amos. Who was Amos? Anybody? Prophet to what? Who did he prophesy to? I think it was the northern kingdom, wasn't it? Here we go. Let's go over to Amos chapter 1. And the words of Amos, who was among the sheep breeders of Tekoa. And notice this next phrase. Which he saw concerning Israel, which he what? Saw concerning Israel when? In the days of Uzziah, king of Judah, in the days of Jeroboam, the son of Joash, king of Israel, 2 years before the earthquake. Amos is going to prophesy concerning conditions he's observing, actually, in the northern kingdom at the time he's living, because what's he using? Why is he discussing? Why is he observing? Why is he prophesying about current conditions? What is he going to tell these people? But what's the point of his book, and a lot of these books and the prophets? Yeah, God's judgment's coming if you don't change your behavior. And so Amos talks about the present. Now he may talk about the future too. He may say, well, if you don't change, here's what's going to happen. But a lot of what these prophets wrote about, I've been reading through Ezekiel the last few days. He's talking about things going on contemporary with him. He's in Babylon, and yet he's writing about things going on where? Back in Jerusalem. Well, he's not there, so obviously it's supernatural knowledge God's given him, but it's present day current events. And he's removed geographically from them. So, present events. But, of course, the one that we really like to discuss is the predictive part, right? Future events. And I guess we could pick a lot of examples of that, right? Let's go over to Isaiah chapter 2. Isaiah chapter 2. Let's look at 2 through 4. Isaiah's living in like the 800s BC, right? Now it shall come to pass in the latter days. Now I know if I read Joel chapter 2, 28 through 30, and Peter's explanation of Joel chapter 2 in Acts chapter 2, verse 17, I know the latter days are when? Huh? The Christian dispensation. Peter says we're in those days. So Isaiah's prophesying about things that are going to happen 800 years later. That the mountain, and we'll talk about this a little bit later in our discussion, that the mountain of the Lord's house shall be established on the top of the mountains, and shall be exalted above the hills, and all nations shall flow to it. Many people shall come and say, Come and let us go up to the mountain of the Lord, to the house of the God of Jacob. He will teach us His ways, and we shall walk in His paths. For out of Zion shall go forth the law, and the word of the Lord from Jerusalem. He shall judge between the nations and rebuke many people. They shall beat their swords into plowshares and their spears into pruning hooks. Nation shall not lift up sword against nation, neither shall they learn war anymore. Now, there's all kinds of religious people that get excited about that stuff, thinking that it's physical in nature. But it's not. This is a prophecy of the church, the coming kingdom of Christ. And he says, number one, it's not just for the Jews, it's for who? All nations. Gentiles too. And by the way, their method of winning converts is not going to be by the sword or by violence. There are religions who win converts by violence. One of the largest in the world is Islam. And you either practice it if you're in an Islamic nation, or you receive physical retribution. And anytime one of them tells you, well, that's not really what we're about, that's a lie. Because even the Quran teaches that it's okay to lie in order to get your way, doesn't it? It does. In order to infiltrate. But Christianity's not that way. We don't convert people by beating them over the head. The Catholic Church tried that, didn't they? The Inquisition and those things. Torturing people. That's not the religion of Christ. But that is a future prophecy. So we've seen past, we've seen present, we've seen future. Future being that particular element. But I'm going to tell you, you can use past as well. You're talking about being an evidence for the divine inspiration of the Scriptures. How did Moses know all that stuff that happened thousands of years before he was born? And then write about it. You know, there's been a lot of people who thought they knew what was going to happen tomorrow, right? And didn't wake up or didn't see the next day. Don't most of you have a pretty good idea what you're going to do tomorrow? Doesn't make us a prophet, though, does it? But the true prophet of God can speak. He has a miracle of revelation from God, and he can specifically and exactly say what's going to happen, not just tomorrow, but months, years, so forth, centuries into the future. Let's go back to Deuteronomy chapter 18. So, we need to know what the test of a prophet is. How do I know somebody's really a prophet or not? And there's several criteria as well. But how do I know a true prophet from a false prophet? Look at Deuteronomy 18. After Moses' prophecy about raising up this prophet and so forth. Look at verse 20. But the prophet who presumes to speak a word in my name which I have not commanded him to speak, or who speaks in the name of other gods, that prophet shall die. And if you say in your heart, how shall we know the word which the Lord has not spoken? When a prophet speaks in the name of the Lord, if the thing does not happen or come to pass, that is the thing which the Lord has not spoken. The prophet has spoken it presumptuously, you shall not be afraid of him. Well, if God gives somebody supernatural knowledge and says this is going to happen, it's going to happen. If it doesn't happen, he says, you know, he's not a real prophet. We see the same test. Go over to 1 John chapter 4. All right? John talks about New Testament prophets. Chapter 4, verse 1. Beloved, do not believe every spirit, but test the spirits, whether they are of God, because many false prophets have gone out into the world. Somebody says, what are you talking about, spirits? Well, that's just a figure of speech. Synecdoche, a part stands for the whole. James 2:26 says, the body apart from the spirit is what? Dead. So in this context, I know that he's talking about just people or humans, because after he says to test the spirits, he says, what's gone out into the world? False prophets. In 1 Peter 3, verse 20, the Bible, Peter talking about Noah, says, how many were saved by water? 8 what? No, it doesn't say people. It says 8 souls were saved. 8 souls. And we use that terminology a lot. If I go over into Exodus chapter 1, it tells me that 70 what went down into Egypt? 70 souls went down into Egypt. So here the word spirit stands for people and specifically prophets. They were to test the prophets, put them to the test. So there's got to be a way to test these prophets. True or false? Is it going to come to pass or not? Well, how do I know then? I need some criteria to determine between a true prophecy and a false prophecy. You say, well, what's the difference between a true prophecy and a false prophecy? I'm going to give you 3. First of all, genuine prophecy involves specific details that are checkable. You ever watch these people on TV, the psychic hotline and all that kind of stuff? You ever called one of those? I haven't, but. What are you going to get from people like that? What kind of information? Yeah, general, vague, you know, you're going to meet somebody sometime, somewhere. Thank you. I appreciate that. You're going to meet somebody sometime, somewhere, and they're going to make a difference in your life. Okay, thank you. Appreciate it. Same thing with horoscopes. It's not checkable. It's not specific enough. It's like a blind man shooting a gun in the air. You're going to hit something eventually. You know, you remember that, it reminds me of that episode with King Ahab. He went into battle the day he died. It said a soldier for the other army drew his bow at random, right? He wasn't shooting at anything. He didn't have a particular target in mind. He just drew it at random and let it go. And it just happened to hit old Ahab where? Didn't hit him in the armor. Hit him in between the joints where the armor meets. Now you're talking about a lucky shot. Wasn't lucky. Who was guiding that arrow? God was. But a guy just pulls back his bow and lets it fly, and it hits him right between where his armor connects. But that's kind of the way these prophets, quote, prophets are. You think about, when you start talking about details and checkability, think about the Messianic prophecies. Over 300 of them. Jesus is going to be born in this particular town. Right? He's going to be betrayed for this particular amount of money. that money is going to be used, according to prophecy, to buy a certain field. He's going to be buried with the rich. And on and on and on it goes. Did you know it even prophesies that they're going to gamble for his clothing? They gambled for his tunic because why? It was seamless from top to bottom. Why did Christ have a garment that was seamless from top to bottom? This is just a piece of extra information for you. Why did he wear a garment that was seamless from top to bottom? Because he's our high priest. And the high priest in the Old Testament had an undergarment that was seamless from top to bottom. That's why. Amazing detail. Amazing detail. And all of those prophecies 400 to 500 years or more. Isaiah is 800 years before they came to pass as far as the suffering servant is concerned. The fact that his bones would not be broken. All of that stuff. So number one, details that are, and so they can be checkable. Number two, genuine prophecy involves significant timing. Now that word significant is a relative term. But there has to be enough time between the utterance of the prophecy and the fulfillment for it to really be miraculous. For instance, Moses' prophecy in Genesis 3:15 is separated from the fulfillment how long? Seed of woman and all that. Satan's going to bruise his head, but he'll crush his heel and so forth. What? Or no, he'll bruise his heel and he'll crush his head. That was made how long before it happened? 1,500 years. 1,500 years. But if I go into Matthew chapter 16 and Luke chapter 18, I see Christ giving amazing details. Well, let's look over there. About his death to his disciples. Does anybody know about how long that was before? Probably about 6 months. Matthew 16:21, from that time Jesus began to show to his disciples that he must go to Jerusalem and suffer many things from the elders and chief priests and scribes and be killed and be raised the third day. Now that's only 6 months before, and yet that's long enough with the details that he gave. If I go over to Luke chapter 18, I think he even gives some more details. Well, I know he does. Notice some of the details he gives in Luke 18:31. He took the 12 aside and said to them, "Behold, we're going up to Jerusalem, and all things that are written by the prophets concerning the Son of Man will be accomplished, for he will be delivered up to the" what? Gentiles. That indicates the kind of death he's going to die. He's not going to be stoned. He's not going to receive a Jewish death. He will be delivered. Now notice, he'll be mocked and insulted, and what else? Spit upon. They will scourge him and kill him. Look at all the details. That's just 6 months before, but that's long enough. So when I say significant amount of time, that's kind of an elastic term, but it's sufficient. I mean, let me give you something, and then we'll end here and pick up next week. If I'm a stockbroker or a commodities broker, and I specialize even in some particular area, tech stocks or a certain kind of commodity, I spend all of my time studying the market conditions and what are the kind of things that are going to affect that stock to make it go up and down. And you know what? If I'm good at my job, number one, I'm going to make a lot of money. I'm going to know how to invest. Number two, you're going to want me to invest your money. But the bottom line is, I can be pretty accurate, at least for the next few days, maybe over the next month, maybe the next year. I can say, you know, I've studied all these things, and I can make some, what I would call, I guess the term would be educated guess. And I'd probably be right most of the time because that's what I do. But I'm still not going to be right all the time. And in fact, I could be on a great streak, And then all of a sudden what happens? The government shuts us down. And everything just, goes to pieces. Stock market drops to 20,000, Dow Jones. So I can't predict that. I can't predict pandemics, government reactions to pandemics. So those are educated guesses. And we can be pretty good at educated guesses. But prophecy is a whole nother ball game. So we'll pick up there next week.